Picture this. You're kneeling in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica, surrounded by centuries of sacred art and holy relics, when suddenly you realize that some of the most powerful religious leaders in history were living double lives that would make modern scandal sheets look tame. What I'm about to reveal isn't just another tale of medieval corruption. These are the stories that the Vatican spent centuries trying to bury, involving popes who turned the holiest office in Christianity into their personal playground for the most depraved behaviors imaginable. Before we dive into these shocking revelations that will forever change how you view papal history, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind religious power, smash that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers what they never taught you in Sunday school. And please drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because it amazes me that we're exploring these forbidden histories together from every corner of the globe. The papal tiara wasn't always worn by saints. In fact, some of the men who claimed to speak for God on earth were living in ways that would make emperors blush and devils applaud. These weren't just minor moral failings or political missteps. We're talking about systematic corruption, sexual depravity, and abuse of power that reached heights so shocking that even medieval chroniclers struggled to document them without their quills trembling in disgust. Let's begin our journey into darkness with the foundation of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. The papal office during certain periods of history held more political influence than any emperor or king. These men controlled armies, commanded vast wealth, and held the keys to salvation itself in the minds of millions. But what happens when that kind of unchecked authority falls into the hands of individuals who view their position not as a sacred trust, but as an opportunity for personal gratification? The answer lies in understanding how the Vatican became a cesspool of moral bankruptcy during what historians now call the pornocracy. This wasn't some underground movement or secret society. This was the official papal court, operating with brazen disregard for every principle they claimed to uphold. Imagine walking through the halls of the Vatican and witnessing scenes that belonged in the most decadent Roman brothels, rather than the center of Christian authority. But before we examine specific cases, we need to understand the systematic failures that made such corruption possible. The medieval church had created a perfect storm of conditions that practically guaranteed moral disaster. First, celibacy requirements that were impossible to enforce created a culture of hypocrisy and secret indulgence. Second, the concentration of enormous wealth and political power in the hands of individuals who often bought their positions rather than earning them through spiritual merit. Third, the complete lack of oversight or accountability, since questioning the Pope was considered tantamount to questioning God himself. These weren't isolated incidents involving one or two bad apples. We're talking about generation after generation of papal leadership that treated the Vatican like their personal kingdom where normal rules simply didn't apply. The corruption was so systematic and entrenched that it became the expected way of doing business, rather than the shocking exception. Consider the environment these men operated in. They lived in palaces decorated with priceless art, surrounded by servants who catered to their every whim, commanding resources that made them richer than most nations. They could excommunicate kings, declare wars, and reshape the political landscape of Europe with a single decree. The temptation to abuse such power wasn't just present, it was overwhelming and constant. What makes these stories so disturbing isn't just the individual acts of depravity, though those are certainly shocking enough. It's the way these behaviors were systematically covered up, rationalized, and even celebrated by the very institution that claim moral authority over the entire Christian world. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this facade created a culture where the most heinous acts could be justified as somehow serving God's will. The financial corruption alone would be enough to destroy any modern institution. Popes were selling religious offices to the highest bidder, creating fake relics to generate revenue, and imposing taxes that would make modern governments seem restrained. But the sexual scandals went far beyond simple adultery or breaking celibacy vows. We're talking about systematic exploitation, abuse of minors, and behaviors so extreme that even the most worldly medieval nobles were appalled. One of the most chilling aspects of this corruption was how it trickled down through the entire church hierarchy. When the man claiming to be Christ's representative on earth was engaging in the most depraved behaviors imaginable, It gave license for similar corruption at every level of the church. Bishops, cardinals, and local priests began to see such behavior as not just acceptable but expected. The psychological toll on believers who discovered the truth about their spiritual leaders cannot be overstated. These were people who had devoted their entire lives to faith, who had tithed their meager earnings to support the church, who had sent their children to serve in religious orders. Discovering that their most sacred beliefs were being perverted by the very men they trusted, most created spiritual trauma that lasted for generations. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the calculated nature of the cover-ups. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary lapses in judgment. The Vatican developed sophisticated systems for hiding evidence, silencing witnesses, and discrediting anyone who dared to speak out. They understood exactly how damaging these revelations would be to their authority and took extraordinary measures to ensure the truth never saw daylight. The evidence for these claims doesn't come from anti-Catholic propaganda or sensationalized modern accounts. These stories are documented in the Vatican's own archives, in the chronicles of contemporary observers, and in the testimonies of those brave enough to speak out despite the enormous personal risk. What we're about to explore represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases of institutional corruption in human history. As we prepare to examine specific cases that will shock even the most cynical observers, remember that we're not just talking about ancient history. The patterns of behavior, the methods of concealment, and the abuse of religious authority that will uncover established precedents that would echo through centuries of church history. The darkest chapters of papal corruption reveal uncomfortable truths about how power operates when it's completely unchecked by accountability or moral restraint. The first name that emerges from the shadows of Vatican history is Pope John XII, whose reign from 955 to 964 AD reads like a manual for how to destroy the credibility of an entire institution. This wasn't a man who occasionally stumbled in his spiritual duties. John XII transformed the Lateran Palace into what contemporary chroniclers described as a brothel, turning the seat of Christian authority into a playground for his sexual appetites that knew no bounds or decency. Born Octavian of Tusculum, he became pope at the shocking age of 18, not through divine calling or spiritual merit, but because his father controlled Rome through military force. From the moment he assumed the papal throne, John XII made it clear that he viewed his position as an opportunity for personal gratification rather than spiritual leadership. The stories that emerged from his papal court were so scandalous that even hardened medieval nobles were left speechless. Witnesses reported that John XII regularly held orgies in the papal apartments, turning sacred spaces into venues for the most depraved sexual activities imaginable. But his appetites weren't limited to willing participants. Multiple accounts describe how he systematically abused his position to coerce women into sexual relationships, using the threat of excommunication or worse to ensure compliance. The papal court became a hunting ground where no woman was safe from his predatory behavior. What makes John XII's story even more disturbing is how he weaponized religious authority to satisfy his lusts. He would perform mock marriages to women he intended to abuse, creating a twisted parody of sacred sacraments. He ordained deacons in stables and appointed bishops while drunk on wine and lust. The man who claimed to hold the keys to heaven was using those very keys to unlock every door to moral depravity. But John XII's corruption extended far beyond sexual misconduct. He turned the papal treasury into his personal bank account, selling religious offices to fund his lifestyle of excess. Sacred relics were auctioned to the highest bidder, holy orders were granted in exchange for sexual favors, and the spiritual welfare of millions became secondary to his immediate gratification. The Vatican under his rule operated more like a criminal enterprise than the center of Christian faith. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that would be unbelievable if they weren't documented by multiple independent sources. John XII allegedly castrated a cardinal who opposed him, blinded his confessor for refusing to absolve his sins, and ordered the murder of anyone who threatened to expose his activities. The man who preached about mercy and forgiveness was practicing torture and execution with casual brutality. The psychological manipulation he employed was perhaps even more sinister than his physical violence. John XII understood that his victims' faith made them vulnerable to spiritual coercion. He would threaten eternal damnation to silence witnesses, promise salvation in exchange for compliance, and use the deepest beliefs of his victims as weapons against them. This wasn't just abuse of power, it was the systematic weaponization of faith itself. Moving deeper into this cesspit of papal corruption, we encounter the Borgia family, whose name became synonymous with every form of moral bankruptcy imaginable. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, elevated papal corruption to levels that shocked even Renaissance Italy, a place where scandal was practically an art form. His reign from 1492 to 1503 represented the absolute nadir of papal morality, a period when the Vatican became indistinguishable from the most depraved secular courts. Alexander VI didn't even pretend to maintain celibacy. He openly flaunted his mistresses, acknowledged his illegitimate children, and used papal resources to advance his family's political ambitions through the most ruthless means available. But his sexual appetites went far beyond simple adultery. Multiple sources document his participation in elaborate orgies held within the Vatican itself, events that combined religious ritual with sexual depravity in ways that defied every principle of Christian teaching. The most infamous of these events was the so-called Banquet of Chestnuts, held in the papal apartments in 1501. Contemporary accounts describe an evening that began with a formal dinner but quickly devolved into a scene of such sexual excess that even hardened courtiers were appalled. Prostitutes were brought into the Vatican, religious artifacts were used as props for sexual games, and the Pope himself participated with enthusiasm that scandalized even his closest supporters. But Alexander VI's corruption reached its most disturbing depths in his relationship with his own daughter, Lucrezia Borgia. While historians debate the exact nature of their relationship, contemporary sources strongly suggest that the Pope's affection for his daughter crossed boundaries that would be criminal by any standard. The whispers about incest within the papal family were so persistent and detailed that they cannot be dismissed as mere political propaganda. The systematic nature of Borgia corruption extended throughout the church hierarchy. Alexander VI sold cardinalships to fund his wars, created new religious offices specifically to generate revenue, and turned excommunication into a business model. The spiritual authority of the church became a commodity to be bought and sold, with salvation itself reduced to a transaction based on political convenience rather than moral worth. What made the Borgia papacy so particularly heinous was how they corrupted the very concept of religious authority. Previous corrupt popes had at least maintained some pretense of spiritual leadership, even while engaging in private misconduct. The Borgias abandoned all pretense, openly flaunting their corruption and daring anyone to challenge their authority. They understood that their position made them effectively untouchable, and they exploited that immunity with breathtaking cynicism. The psychological impact on the faithful was devastating. Pilgrims who traveled thousands of miles to receive papal blessings found themselves witnessing scenes that belonged in the most depraved secular courts rather than the center of Christian authority. The cognitive dissonance of seeing their spiritual father engaging in behaviors that contradicted everything they had been taught about Christian morality created spiritual trauma that lasted for generations. The stories we've uncovered today represent more than just historical curiosities or medieval scandals. They reveal the darkest truths about what happens when absolute power meets human weakness, when sacred trust becomes a tool for exploitation, and when the very institutions meant to guide humanity's moral compass become the source of its corruption. From John XII's transformation of the Vatican into a brothel to the Borgia family's systematic perversion of religious authority, we've witnessed how the holiest office in Christianity was repeatedly defiled by men who saw divine appointment as a license for depravity. These weren't isolated incidents or unfortunate lapses in judgment. They represent systematic patterns of abuse that established precedents still echoing through religious institutions today. The methods of concealment, the weaponization of faith, and the calculated silencing of victims created a blueprint for institutional corruption that transcends any single era or organization. What makes these revelations so haunting isn't just the individual acts of cruelty and perversion, but how they were justified, covered up, and perpetuated by an entire system designed to protect the perpetrators rather than their victims. The faithful who trusted these men with their deepest spiritual needs became prey in a hunting ground disguised as sanctuary. Understanding this history doesn't diminish faith itself, but it reminds us that no institution, no matter how sacred its claimed purpose, is immune to corruption when power goes unchecked. These stories serve as eternal warnings about the dangers of blind trust and the necessity of holding even our most revered leaders accountable to the very principles they claim to represent. If these hidden truths have opened your eyes to the complexities of religious history, make sure to subscribe for more content that uncovers the stories they never wanted you to know.